Alright, welcome to my channel. This is Richard Kirkham at Kirkham A Movie A Day. I'm going to try and catch up with some of my recent film excursions in a quick way with a few short videos trying to cover the films that I saw this last week that I just don't have time to write about. First up is First Man. This is my most highly anticipated film of the year. As it turns out, it was excellent. Although it's not perfect, there are a few things about it that I thought were problematic. I do think Ryan Gosling is excellent in the film. He plays a stoic version of Neil Armstrong, which I understand is a pretty accurate description of Neil. He was not particularly outgoing, he wasn't super jovial, and he was heroic, but he was heroic in a quiet, technocratic way. And the film shows all of that. It's couched in personal tragedy. Mr. Armstrong lost a young child a few years before his fame caught up with the rest of us, and as a test pilot, he went through a crisis. Early on in the film, we see him, as a matter of fact, it's the opening section of the film, we see him flying the X-15, and when I was a child, I remember actually seeing the X-15 zooming across the desert when we were in our car crossing the highway there up near Edwards Air Force Base. It actually paralleled the road for a few seconds as we went by, and it was pretty thrilling. I have no idea which astronaut was flying that high-speed aircraft at the time, but I'll tell you what, I'd like to think it was Neil Armstrong. This is a great companion piece to The Right Stuff. It follows a similar sort of track, except that it doesn't have the sense of camaraderie and joviality and heroicism that film had. It's very much couched in the technical struggle that the NASA program was going through, and especially the personal struggles that Neil Armstrong was facing. It's chronological in nature, so we get a chance to see the parts of the space program that we missed after The Right Stuff. It's kind of set in the same time period, but also a little bit after. Gus Grissom is a character in the film, and of course Gus Grissom was one of the main characters in The Right Stuff. The film was maybe, I don't know if it was criticized, but maybe derided a little bit by some people on the internet as jazz in space, because Damien Chazelle, who's the director and writer of the film, made two previous films that featured jazz music, and so people sometimes thought maybe it's going to just represent that kind of movement. I don't know, they thought Ryan Gosling was going to be dancing onto the Saturn V rocket and into the lunar capsule. That's not what happens. In fact, as I said, the story shows him as being fairly stoic. He does have an expected response to the death of his child. It's a tragedy, and it puts a strain on his life with his wife, but also kind of focuses his attention in a way to maybe bury his grief is by pouring himself into the work of becoming an astronaut and successfully navigating his craft to the moon. The film's major flaw that I see is that in the scenes that don't involve the space shots, they continue to use the shaky cam that is supposed to give it a naturalistic sense of storytelling, but what it really does is keeps us unsettled the whole time that we're watching the movie, and in fact it will probably create a little bit of motion sickness in some people. I thought it worked, the shaky cam kind of effect works very well in that opening sequence in the X-15, and when they get in the Saturn rockets and they are launched into space, it also feels like it's really appropriate. And as the lunar lander is descending and the Eagle is headed toward the surface of the moon, that makes sense as well. But we don't just get it in those sequences, we get it in sequences involving his wife and his children, We get it involving him in his relationship with the other astronauts there at NASA. And it's one of those things that I think is a little disconcerting. Um, this is an excellent film. This is really very good though, and it's directed well by somebody who might not have been seen as the kind of person who could do an epic space film, but it's an epic space film with fantastic effects. It integrates images uh, in a way that is very reminiscent sometimes of 2001, but also of other traditional views of space that we have from our memory. I was a space kid, you know, I was like everybody else in the 1960s. We looked at the astronauts as heroes. We anticipated the fight, not the fight, the space race with the Russians. We were thrilled when we made some advancement. John Glenn was one of those names that everybody knew, and when the moon landing happened, it captured the whole world. And this film does a good job at kind of portraying the world at that time. Look, 1968, the year before we landed on the moon, was maybe one of the most dramatic years in the country. People sometimes think, well, our current political times are really pretty awful. Well, they must forget, or they didn't live through 1968 when we had assassinations, riots, war going on that was very unpopular, and life was very dramatically divisive. But the moon landing brought people together, and that's one of those things that this film shows, that even though Neil Armstrong and his wife had their problems, they were together through this experience. She insisted that he talk to his kids about the possibility that he might not come back, because that was a very real possibility. Apollo 1 had a tragic ending, and I think those people who are familiar with the space race won't be surprised by what happens with some of the other astronauts, but they will be shocked and moved by that particular episode. Jason Clarke appears in the film as astronaut White, and he's a neighbor and a friend of Armstrong, and he's very effective in the movie as well. You're going to find that Buzz Aldrin is portrayed as kind of an ass, and he appears to be maybe the jovial, lively counterpart to Neil Armstrong, so maybe they were a good matchup. But the story doesn't really focus on their partnership. It doesn't focus on the three guys who were going to the moon. It focuses on Neil Armstrong, and it tells his story. He's a technocrat. He was a civilian. That was one of the things that separated him from a lot of the other astronauts. And he was kind of a loner. And his landing on the moon was the one thing that maybe was unifying and did bring him closer to the rest of humanity, even though it was an action that was very different from anything that any human had done before. In the long run, he is a hero. I think he was portrayed very well, like I said, by Ryan Gosling. And I do have one final thing to say about Neil Armstrong. A year after he landed on the moon, he got his master's degree in aeronautical engineering at USC, so he's a Trojan. Fight on.